A Black father in Mississippi drilled his children every night, teaching them how to hit the floor if a bullet ever shattered their quiet, and teaching them which sounds meant run and which meant stay down. Medgar Evers led the state's NAACP, doubling its membership as his mailbox was bombed and white supremacists traced his every move. When he was murdered in his own driveway, investigators found fingerprints, witnesses, and a suspect within days, evidence that should have solved the case. So why did justice stall for 30 years? To understand the murder Mississippi refused to solve, we have to start inside the Evers family home, where fear was as routine as dinner. Night after night, the Evers family moved through a routine most American families could never imagine. Medgar Evers, his wife Myrlie, and their 3 children lived with a constant threat of violence pressing in from every side. Before bed, the children practiced what to do if gunfire shattered the quiet. The drill was as regular as brushing their teeth. They learned to drop to the floor at the first sharp crack, to crawl away from windows, and to listen for the difference between a car backfiring and the sharper, flatter sound of a rifle. Myrlie instructed them to stay low and still, no matter how scared they felt, until she gave the all clear. The children were taught which rooms offered the most protection and how to recognize the warning signs, the sudden hush in the neighborhood, headlights lingering too long outside, the sound of gravel crunching under unfamiliar tires. Medgar Evers' presence as an activist had turned their home into a target. The family address was no secret in Jackson. Neighbors watched for strange cars, but threats still arrived by phone, by letter, and sometimes by fire. On more than one occasion, Myrlie found herself dousing flames from a Molotov cocktail before the fire department could arrive. The children, once carefree, now measured their steps and their voices, always aware that a single mistake, an open curtain, or a porch light left on, could draw danger closer. Inside the walls of their modest house, fear became part of the daily routine. The Evers children learned to sleep with one ear open, to flinch at sudden noises, and to move quickly from room to room. Family dinners were often interrupted by knocks at the door or the distant echo of angry voices. Yet, even as anxiety threaded through every evening, the family clung to small rituals of normalcy. Medgar's laughter at the kitchen table, Myrlie's steady reassurance, and the children's whispered prayers offered a fragile comfort. It was a reminder that their lives, though shadowed by threats, were worth defending. In their home, courage was not a grand gesture, but a habit repeated quietly every single night. Medgar Evers' public life unfolded on a battleground that stretched far beyond his own front yard. As Mississippi's first NAACP field secretary, beginning in 1954, he traveled thousands of miles each year, organizing voter registration drives, building youth councils, and launching boycotts against businesses that refused to serve Black customers. Under his leadership, NAACP membership in the state more than doubled, a surge that did not go unnoticed by those determined to keep segregation in place. Evers' campaigns reached into rural counties where Black families risked their jobs and their safety just to sign a registration form. He coordinated networks of volunteers who documented intimidation at polling places and reported on violence that local authorities refused to investigate. Evers was relentless in pushing for justice in cases that white officials had long ignored. He personally investigated 9 murders of Black Mississippians, including the lynching of Emmett Till and the suspicious imprisonment of Clyde Kennard. Each investigation brought new threats, but also drew national attention to the brutality that defined life for many in the Deep South. Evers' name became a fixture in headlines and on radio broadcasts, making him both a beacon of hope and a target for those who saw civil rights as an existential threat. The backlash was swift and organized. White citizens' councils distributed flyers warning that Evers's activism would bring chaos to Mississippi. Local police sometimes shadowed his car, not to protect him, but to monitor his movements. His home was firebombed, and his phone rang with threats at all hours. Yet Evers rarely slowed his pace. He believed that visibility was a form of protection, that the more people who saw what was happening in Mississippi, the harder it would be for the violence to remain hidden. By 1963, the scale of Evers's work had shifted the ground beneath Mississippi's rigid social order. Voter rolls grew, boycotts cut into business profits, and the pattern of silence around racial violence began to crack. But every step forward came with a cost. The forces arrayed against Evers were not just individuals, but systems, political, legal, and economic, built to resist change at any price. Just after midnight on June 12, 1963, headlights swept across the Evers driveway in Jackson. Medgar Evers stepped from his car, arms full of T-shirts calling for an end to segregation. He barely made it to the rear of the vehicle before a single shot cracked the night. The bullet struck him in the back, tearing through his body, shattering bone and organs, and continuing its path through a window and into the kitchen. Evers collapsed onto the driveway, blood pooling beneath him. Inside, Myrlie Evers and the children heard the gunfire. Myrlie rushed to the door and found Medgar face down on the concrete. The children's voices rose in panic. "Daddy, get up!" as Myrlie tried to pull him inside, her hands slick with blood. Neighbors, already awake from the rifle's echo, called for help. An ambulance arrived quickly, but at the local hospital, Evers was initially refused admission because of his race. Only after Myrlie insisted did staff relent, but by then, precious minutes had slipped away. Doctors worked to stop the bleeding, but the wound was catastrophic. Within an hour of the shooting, Medgar Evers was pronounced dead. The family's worst fears, rehearsed night after night, had come true in a matter of seconds. The sense of safety that lingered in their home vanished, replaced by a silence that settled over Jackson and radiated across the country. The urgency of justice now pressed in, demanding answers for a life stolen in the dark. Within hours of the shooting, investigators began piecing together the evidence left behind in Medgar Evers's driveway. A search of the area led police to a honeysuckle thicket nearly 150 feet from the house. There, hidden in the tangled brush, they recovered a recently fired Eddystone Enfield .30-06 rifle fitted with a telescopic sight. The weapon had not been wiped clean. Fingerprints lifted from the scope were compared to military records, producing a match. Byron De La Beckwith, a Marine Corps veteran and outspoken segregationist. Ballistics tests confirmed that the bullet retrieved from the Evers home matched the rifle found in the thicket. Witnesses had noticed a white Plymouth Valiant circling the neighborhood in the days leading up to the murder. On the night of June 12th, several neighbors recalled seeing the same car parked near the Evers home. Details like a distinctive Masonic emblem on the vehicle's bumper would later become important in court. Beckwith's own statements in the weeks before the shooting had drawn attention as well. He had openly threatened violence against civil rights leaders in public conversations and at white citizens' council meetings. The investigation moved quickly. By June 23rd, less than 2 weeks after the murder, Beckwith was arrested at his Greenwood, Mississippi home. The physical evidence, the rifle, the fingerprints, and the eyewitness accounts formed a case that on paper left little room for doubt. Police and prosecutors assembled a file that documented each link in the chain, preparing to bring the facts before a jury. The question was not whether the case could be made, but whether Mississippi's courts would allow it to matter. Inside the Hinds County Courthouse in 1964, the case against Byron De La Beckwith moved from evidence to argument before a jury of 12 white men. In Mississippi, this was not unusual. Jury lists were drawn from registered voters, and Black Mississippians, barred from the ballot box by literacy tests and intimidation, were systematically excluded from serving. The panel that would decide Beckwith's fate reflected the state's power structure, not its population. Prosecutors presented their case: the rifle found in the honeysuckle, Beckwith's fingerprints on the scope, the eyewitnesses who described his car circling the neighborhood. The defense did not challenge the evidence directly. Instead, their strategy was to remind jurors of what they shared. In closing arguments, defense attorneys spoke of Southern traditions and warned that a guilty verdict would threaten the way of life that the men in the jury box had grown up defending. The language in the courtroom was careful but unmistakable. Jurors were asked to weigh not just the facts, but their allegiance to segregation and the expectations of their community. Trial transcripts reveal moments when the judge's instructions blurred the line between law and custom. Jurors were reminded of their duty to be impartial, but also told to consider the character of the defendant, a man known for his public opposition to integration. The message was clear. The outcome mattered not just for Beckwith, but for the social order outside the courthouse walls. Both trials ended without a verdict. In each, a handful of jurors refused to convict, resulting in what the law called a hung jury. No one declared Beckwith innocent. No one claimed the evidence was lacking. Instead, the process itself became the shield. The inability to reach a unanimous decision was presented as proof that the system worked, even as it left Medgar Evers' murder unresolved. In the eyes of the state, a deadlocked jury meant justice had been served, at least as far as it was meant to go. After the two hung juries in 1964, the state of Mississippi quietly closed the door on Medgar Evers' case. Prosecutors filed away the evidence, the rifle, the fingerprint records, and the witness statements into courthouse archives. No new trial was scheduled. No further investigation was launched. The official explanation rested on the notion of due process. The courts had done their work, and the outcome, however unsatisfying, was accepted as final. Behind closed doors, officials cited the jury deadlock as proof that the system had functioned as designed, even as the facts remained unchanged and the crime remained unresolved. Federal authorities, who had followed the case closely in the aftermath of the murder, also stepped back. The Justice Department declined to bring civil rights charges, citing a lack of federal jurisdiction. Files were closed, correspondence ended, and the case was left to the state. The message was clear. Responsibility for justice in Medgar Evers' murder belonged to Mississippi alone, and Mississippi had chosen to move on. For the Evers family, the silence was its own kind of verdict. Myrlie Evers and her children waited year after year for news that never came. The evidence, so painstakingly gathered in the days after the shooting, gathered dust. The rifle sat in storage, fingerprints unchallenged, witness memories fading with time. Each passing year made it harder to imagine that anyone would be held accountable. The family lived in a state of suspended grief, denied both justice and closure. This long pause was not an accident of bureaucracy or a simple oversight. Delay became a shield, protecting the state from the uncomfortable questions that a new trial would raise. Witnesses who might have testified grew older or left Mississippi. The public's attention shifted elsewhere. In the absence of action, the case slipped quietly into dormancy, preserved in archives, but unresolved in the lives of those left behind. The strategy was simple: let time do what the courts would not. By the early 1990s, a very different Mississippi stood on the horizon. The Voting Rights Act had forced open the doors of jury rooms, making it possible, finally, for Black citizens to serve alongside white peers. The state's political climate, once tightly controlled by segregationist officials, began to shift under the weight of new laws and changing public opinion. But the real momentum came from outside the courthouse, as journalists and activists refused to let Medgar Evers' murder fade into history. Jerry Mitchell, a reporter at the Jackson Clarion-Ledger, spent months poring over old trial records and state archives. In the process, he uncovered files from the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission that revealed a secret hand in Beckwith's defense. The state itself had secretly aided the accused, providing juror dossiers and inside information to help sway the verdict. Those revelations, published in the press, reignited outrage and brought national attention back to the long-dormant case. At the same time, Myrlie Evers Williams kept pressing for justice, urging prosecutors to revisit the evidence that had been shelved for decades. Bobby DeLauder, a young assistant district attorney, took up the challenge. Unlike his predecessors, DeLauder had access to a mixed jury pool, no longer filtered by race, and a public newly aware of the state's past interference. He reassembled the evidence from 1964. The rifle, the fingerprint records, the testimony of witnesses who had never recanted. No new forensic breakthroughs were needed. What changed was the willingness to bring the case before a jury that better reflected Mississippi's true population. In December 1990, a grand jury re-indicted Byron De La Beckwith for the murder of Medgar Evers, setting the stage for a trial the state could no longer control behind closed doors. On February 5, 1994, more than 3 decades after Medgar Evers was killed, a jury in Jackson, Mississippi, delivered a verdict that had eluded the state for 30 years. Byron De La Beckwith, then 73, was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The decision came after less than a day of deliberation, hours, not weeks, despite the fact that the evidence presented had not changed since the failed prosecutions of 1964. The rifle, the fingerprints, the eyewitness testimony, even the photographs of Beckwith's car, all had been available from the beginning. What had changed was the jury itself. This time, black and white Mississippians sat side by side in the jury box, drawn from a pool that finally reflected the state's real population. The speed of the verdict stood in stark contrast to the endless deadlock of the past. In 1964, all white juries had been asked to weigh the same facts and had failed to act. Their silence stretched out as a kind of verdict in itself. By 1994, the outcome was no longer determined by solidarity among men who saw themselves as guardians of a social order. Instead, the deliberations were brief, the conclusion clear. Beckwith was led away in handcuffs, the courtroom quiet except for the shuffling of feet and the sound of reporters scribbling notes. Yet, even as the sentence was read, the question of justice lingered. The evidence had always been enough. The real barrier had been time, 30 years of delay that allowed the state to avoid reckoning with its own choices. The conviction was not the result of new facts, but of a new willingness to let those facts matter. For the Evers family and for Mississippi, the verdict closed one chapter but left the larger story unresolved. Why justice had been postponed for so long, and how many other truths remained buried by the passage of years. Today, the mechanics of justice, jury selection, prosecutorial discretion, and public pressure still decide who is heard and who is silenced. Mississippi's decades-long delay shows that evidence alone is never enough without the will to act. As new cases echo old patterns, the lesson is clear. Justice delayed is justice denied, and accountability must never wait for permission. What justice demands today, history will judge tomorrow.